It's Adam from Loose Pixel. And if you're a concept artist, an illustrator, an animator, a tattoo artist, if you are a digital artist and you're really on the fence or unsure about Adobe's recent eyebrow-raising policy, implying that they're asking for your permission to scrape, aka extract the data from the artwork that you produce on their app that you pay for to train their AI models, and the subsequent legal and public backlash that was a result of it by people who read the fine print and caught them on it, then I recommend you pay attention to every single word that comes out of my mouth moving forward, because I want you to know what I know about Adobe as a company with over 25 years of experience working as a concept artist, illustrator, designer, animator, director, supervisor, teacher, etc. Using almost exclusively Adobe Photoshop and many other Adobe apps for that matter. So I'm going to take you back, because once you know what I know, you won't only be aware of what Adobe's intentions have been and are today, but their intentions are going to be, and where the future of digital painting lies in terms of apps in general. It's a big deal. This is a big conversation I want to have with you. So I'm going to take you back 25 years. In Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop became the industry standard almost immediately upon me launching myself into my career. It was always there. And little quality of life things changed over the years as new technology and hardware and drawing tablets and pen displays, blah, yada, yada, yada. And they've made a lot of little innovations and improvements to their app, in most part towards photographers. Some little quality of life things for digital artists, but mostly for photographers, even 25 years later. However, it was the best app we had access to. It was the only app we had access to. Digital artists could benefit from this raster-based graphic software. So we used it because it was what's available. And they, in turn, their brush engine has always been really good and very reliable. It's always been their kind of their main staple thing. It's kind of the things that's kept them on the map. However, they quickly came to realize that people needed to learn their app, and that digital artists like myself, young aspiring professionals, couldn't afford the $1,000 plus license that they were asking. That was really mostly aimed towards businesses in general, not the general user like you and I. They didn't realize we needed to learn this stuff necessarily, but we did to get jobs in digital painting, but did nothing at the time to change their pricing software, their pricing structure, to make it more accessible to digital painters like myself, to artists that needed to use it to build portfolios to get the jobs, because we were expected to, but they didn't change anything. But digital being digital, torrenting softwares quickly became a thing. Things like Kazaa and Morpheus started to become a thing, which gave us access to downloading it illegally, as they said, with a great authoritative voice, like any of us gave a shit. But we downloaded it, we got access to it, and I found it very, very ironic that years later, the 500 plus people that I worked with in the studio all knew Photoshop proficiently, but none of us could afford it in most parts. So it's kind of ironic that we all knew and needed access to it. But what torrenting did was it also pushed companies like Photoshop, like the music industry, for instance, any company, any industry that relied on digital content, to adjust their pricing structure to avoid bankruptcy, because torrenting was just killing them. Now, why was torrenting killing Photoshop? Why was it killing Adobe as a company? Why was it causing them to struggle financially? Because their financial bottom line was very dependent on users like me. It was users, the hundreds of thousands of artists that needed to use their app, but they were starting to lose a lot of money. So what did they do? They did what they were forced to do. They switched to a subscription model that continues to this day. Okay? And there's the first dirty move from Photoshop. At the time, if all you needed access was to one app, Photoshop, then you could get Photoshop/Lightroom exclusively, which is not cheap for a regular user who needs to learn their app. But it was the lesser of two evils, because the alternative to that Photoshop has continued to model their pricing structure on, was if you need more than one app, you don't just buy a second, you don't just pay for double the subscription cost. No, you have to buy the whole goddamn suite of dozens of apps that nobody asked for. So if you use Photoshop, fine. Photoshop Lightroom. If you need Photoshop and Audition or Photoshop and Premiere or Photoshop and After Effects, now you have to buy dozens of apps, none of which you give a shit about and care to use. They force it down your throat and the cost to match it. And I'm sure they've received hundreds of thousands of complaints. I know they got one from me many years ago, and they've never done anything to change the structure because they haven't had to, because they haven't been forced to, like torrenting forced them to change to a subscription model in the first place. And what a lot of people don't know is, years ago I posted a video talking about how I had switched to Mac. And the main incentive for me to switch to Mac was just because I'd gotten dicked around by Microsoft so much. I switched over to Apple Silicon and I've never looked back. The only regret I had was certain plugins that I couldn't access on Apple Silicon, but everything else was, I was very happy to move to it. But a lot of people don't know that one of the added incentives, another very big contributor to the fact that I switched to Macs, was Adobe. Because when I was working as a teacher in the public school system prior to me starting my online mentorship in 2015, I got very good discounts, but I'm living in a country that has access. I'm living in a city that has access to good schools, public schools that allow students and teachers to get access to discounts of Adobe. But once I went independent, it became immediately evident that now I'm not getting that teacher discount, that it's insanely expensive. Again, it's insanely expensive for users like you and me, not for businesses. Businesses don't give a shit about that cost, but you have to learn that app. I'm a teacher. I teach students from all over the world. They have to learn that app too if they want to work in-house in a studio, but at least 60% of my students can't even come close to affording that. They're aspiring young broke artists like the rest of us. They can't afford that shit. But Adobe has done nothing to change that. So what do? Well, they do what they can do. They can't afford Photoshop, so they use things like Clip Studio Paint, originally Manga Studio, Clip Studio Paint, Adobe Sketchbook, Sketchbook Pro, or if you've got an iPad, you do Art Studio Pro, Procreate, Infinite Painter, etc. Alternative apps that cost a fraction of the cost with slight compromises. Maybe the app didn't have all the features that Photoshop had, which was taking a little bit of a hit, but hey, you got to learn to paint, you got to do what you got to do. C'est la vie. Adobe never did anything to change the pricing structure. It still is what it is, and if you don't like it, if you can't afford it, then you're not welcome into the club. However, that's gonna change. Why? Because on my iPad, I have access to apps that I'd spend less than a couple of dozen dollars on, that's a one-time purchase and I own it for life, that can outperform the features of Photoshop, that have things in it that Photoshop has never bothered to implement into their app, because after 25 effing years, they still fail to acknowledge the fact that digital painters, raster-based painters that draw on effing pen displays, there's little to no innovation. I could literally install a version of Photoshop that's 15 years old and it's 99% the same app it is today. It's still completely usable. Barely anything's changed. They have done nothing to acknowledge the fact that digital painters in 25 years are one of their target main demographics. They still treat it like it's a photo editing app. So essentially, Photoshop is, Adobe have two photographer apps, Lightroom and Photoshop. And digital painters can use Photoshop if they want, and because they haven't had any real competition, they haven't bothered to innovate on it at all. What? Recently used brushes? Really? Is that the best thing you can offer me in the last 10 freaking years? That's pretty much it. And this is a common trend I've seen in Adobe. Remember I mentioned that the fact that I've been to exclusive little VIP events? I went to one in Old Montreal about 15 whatever years ago. I was a director at the time. I was invited to this event, and some corporate douchebag is introducing Photoshop's new features for their upcoming, because they were trying to sell businesses on licensing their future versions of Photoshop. And after going through a whole list of things that nobody really gave a shit about, I swear to God, every face in that place was like this. They saved the best for last. Adobe saves the best for last. And they look at all of us in the face and they go, guys, check this out. You can now rotate your canvas. expecting everybody in the place to go, oh, yay, great, wonderful. No. You know what people did? Good for you. Do you know why nobody gave a shit even though it was something we all desperately needed? It's because we'd been asking for it for 10 years. Because Coral Painter implemented it a decade before Photoshop did and it worked perfectly. And when Photoshop introduced it, we had been begging for it for years. And then when they implemented it, it was buggy, it was crashy. If anybody remembers the first days of OpenGL and implementation into Photoshop, it was complete freaking garbage. And it was just the most unreliable, crashy piece of shit. They ironed it out eventually, but it was like, no, man, you're not getting any praise for that. They really wanted praise for just listening to people. Since then, their color picker is still the worst color. Photoshop's color picker is the worst piece of shit I've ever used. You still can't mix pigments. Art Studio Pro. You remember I keep going on about Art Studio Pro? I've never done a sponsored video for them in my life. You click on a little button that says pigment, and you can mix yellow and blue, and it makes green. With every other digital painting app, including, well, I can't speak for all the other ones, but for Photoshop, you mix yellow and blue, you get gray. As it's been for many, many years. Why couldn't Adobe fix that? Why couldn't they fix their color picker? Why, when I switch from a hue saturation value slider to a RGB slider to do color notes or to achieve color harmonies, does it default to this color picker? I have to go through a pancake menu to switch sliders? Really? And that the little color swatch that I've got is 1 by 1 centimeter that doesn't get bigger or smaller depending on how much I scale my color palette? Nothing. No color mixers, no brush improvements. They've been relying on a reliable brush engine and basic bullshit quality of life stuff that they've been relying on for the last 2 decades. And they've done nothing to innovate. In their eyes, it's still a photographer app, despite the fact that digital painters, tattoo artists, illustrators, designers depend on this app. Thankfully, as I mentioned, apps are catching up. Art Studio Pro, Procreate, Infinite Painter. Now, there's no excuse. Now the apps are more powerful, they're faster, they have more features in a nice portable little iPad or some Android tablet. We have access to those apps. We've got Apple Pencil Hover. We've got the pinch squeeze thing with the new M4 that's coming out. The Apple Pencil Hover that came out in the 2022 version of the iPad. Now I can do all of my professional work using all the keyboard shortcuts I would in Photoshop. It's basically a total Photoshop replacement for the iPad. I don't need Photoshop anymore. And the more artists like me and all these other digital painters, Borodante, Brad Colbo, Cynics, Ergo Josh, Tyler Edlin, all these guys, as the more we make buzz about iPad apps, the more Photoshop, if they ever paid attention, would start to notice that they're starting to become old hat. They're starting to no longer be the big kid on the block, and they're being outshined by a lot of people, but Photoshop won't notice because they've been living in a state of complacency for 2.5 decades. They literally have, okay? Let's go back to that 2022 iPad conversation. I was testing out different apps because I got the new M4. I'm waiting for the nano texture version to come out soon, probably getting it this week, hopefully. And I've been testing out different apps to see when and if other apps are finally going to implement the rotation and the pinch feature for the new Apple Pencil Pro. Art Studio Pro immediately had it out within 48 hours. Procreate, I think they've just had an update that's kind of implementing something, but I'm not sure. I don't use Procreate a lot, but they're a bit late to the game. Other apps are still trying to catch up. But 99% of the apps, all at this point, have Apple Pencil Hover, where you can actually see your cursor where your cursor is so you can scale your brush, which is an absolutely essential tool for digital painters, for doing what I do. Photoshop for the iPad doesn't have the pinch feature yet. It doesn't have the rotation feature. It doesn't even have fucking Apple Pencil Hover implemented into the software. If you go back on all of my app reviews on my channel, look up the one for Photoshop for the iPad dating when it first came out years ago. Years ago. It's the only app review that I've done where my thumbnail is this. Because it was the worst garbage app, so much so that I couldn't help but rant in that video. I threw my pencil on the table and I walked away like, you losers. We've been waiting for you guys to do something for the iPad for years, and this is the shit you deliver us, and they haven't done a goddamn thing to improve it ever since. They don't give a rat's ass. It's a shit app. Don't waste a penny on that piece of shit. I know grandmothers who know nothing but knitting to produce a better app than that Photoshop. It's absolute garbage. We're talking about a mega company. However, that brings us to today. And Photoshop, with all their money and all their innovation and all their R&D, all their access, all their corporate heads and funding that they have access to, are very excitedly announcing an update to their app that they expect all of us artists and photographers and tattoo artists and illustrators and designers to be not only excited about, but thankful for. AI. Because you know what? I know what every digital artist out there, I know what every photographer has been asking for since the dawn of time. You know what I want Photoshop to do? I want it to do the art for me. I want to type in some words like I would in Stable Diffusion. I want to just type in a couple of words and see some AI generated bullshit show up on my screen. I don't want to take a good photograph and do a little bit of light contrast and color editing. No. I want to just take a picture of my little doohickey over here, take a picture of it, and just stick it into Photoshop and then auto-generate a background for it. Who asked for that? Show of hands below. On a scale from 1 to 10, I want you to give me a rating at the beginning of any comment you make with the number that represents how excited you are that AI is coming to Photoshop. This Firefly bullshit. 1 being, go F yourself. 10 being, oh my God, this is life-changing. I'm so excited. Maybe there'll be a few 10s out there, but I guarantee you, you have my word, most of you are going to be giving it a very, very low ranking, aren't you? Because the joy of art is in the creation of art. It's the meditative, thoughtful process of working things out. It's a problem solving. It's an exploration. It's a sculpting process. It's a hands-on. It's a tactile thing. I don't want some stupid AI generated bullshit. No. It's like, why bother to get fit and play sports when I can just hit a button and it can play the game and win it for me? Nobody asked for that. But Adobe are all over that shit. And they want to be the first on top of that shit, because what they're doing is they're turning this painting app that digital painters have been using for 2.5 decades, like myself, plus, and they're turning it into another AI prompting generator. And they're expecting us artists, us hardworking artists that went through years of education and hard work to learn and master the craft of art, spending our money, investing our time and energy, and investing ourselves into the mastery of this craft, slowly but surely, and all of the ups and down struggles, just to have some fucking corporate head do it for us by pressing a button. They are completely tone deaf to what artists have ever wanted, ever needed, ever asked for. They've always done what's been in Adobe's best interest and don't give a shit about their users, never have. What does this mean for Adobe as a company now and moving forward into the future, and digital painting in general? Moving forward, like most artists, you're going to see more and more as we move forward through this industry. More and more artists are going to be pushing iPad or Android tablet apps on you. You owe nothing to Photoshop as a company. And in my opinion, they have always been the enemy to artists. They are corporate heads that have corporate needs and don't give a shit about the people who have kept them alive for all these years. They have dumped us on the curb like narcissistic partners, and they're already moving on to the next endeavor, and they don't give a rat's ass. And that's why I've never had a stitch of loyalty to Adobe as a company. And in my opinion, neither should you if you know any better. I think they're assholes. And what they're saying as far as, no, this is all necessary shit, we need this, is rest assured, there is more proof than you'll ever need that Adobe lie through their teeth all the time. They have no qualms about lying to your face, about making false promises to get you to invest in their company, and then they dump you on the curb once they've had their way with you. They've done it. They've been doing it over the last few years. There's news upon news about that. Don't fool yourself. So what do I suggest? Don't invest your money in Adobe. Don't promote them. Unless you're trying to personally fund AI art. The only reason I have it, the only reason why I use Adobe Photoshop right now is because I teach it. It's because I need to be able to provide my students with access to this. But guaranteed, I push other digital painting apps on them all the time because I know it's a lot more affordable for them. Do your homework. Don't be ignorant to the facts, and don't spend all of your hard-earned money on people who don't have your best interest in mind in return. Sound good? With that said, I love you all with all my heart, and happy painting. Take care.